serious? Did you, or someone you know, ever attend a wedding where the bride or groom was left at the altar? How did it turn out? I posted this in another thread about the most embarrassing thing you ever saw happen to a teacher. My entire 4th grade class was in attendance at our teacher's wedding where she was left at the altar. The whole situation was ugly. My teacher was the bride and was about 3/4 down the aisle when the groom decided he couldn't do it. He walked off to the side and at first my teacher and her father didn't notice and kept walking, smiling radiantly. There was about a minute of really solid confusion, last minute cold feet, bathroom emergency, before everyone realized what was going on. My teacher was whisked out of the church and an announcement was made that there was not going to be a wedding. This happened the 2nd or 3rd week of June. She didn't come back for the last week of school. Not exactly what OP asked for, but it is an amazing image, so I'll throw in with it. Bride and groom apparently had discussed the smashing the piece of wedding cake in each other's face. They had decided they would not do it. They cut the cake. She takes the piece and smashes it into his face and loudly announces and there is nothing he can do about it. He lifted the entire cake and dropped it on her head. The marriage only lasted a few years. Yes, my friend's groom-to-be left her at the altar. He took the tickets to Hawaii for their honeymoon and instead went with his brother. She spent a year dating around before he begged her to take him back, saying that he was wrong. He, a very well-off young lawyer, bought her a huge rock and paid for a lavish wedding and she agreed. They were married soon after and now have a baby daughter. This actually happened to me. The guy I was supposed to marry just didn't show up at all. He called all of his friends and family on his side and told them not to bother showing up because he wouldn't be there. We waited around till about an hour after the wedding started and finally got a text message saying he wasn't coming. So I got to look like a jerk by telling my family, oh, sorry, there won't be a wedding today. It was mortifying. And to top things off, my son was asking me why his daddy didn't want to marry mommy. Very hard to explain that to a 2-year-old, edit. Thanks for the super awesome support and just the overall chatting. You guys are awesome. Edit 2. Thanks for the gold. X2 less than 3. I was at the wedding for one of my sister's friends who was the bride. The bride never showed up at the wedding and no one could find her. After several hours the groom and his family all went home. Turned out the bride went for a wild night of partying and slept with some guy she met at a club. She was passed out drunk at his place all day long before she came around and realized she missed her own wedding. She was out with a friend that did nothing to stop her from getting wasted and screwing around. I think her friend let her get carried away because she thought the bride wouldn't have been a good wife and figured it was the easiest way to get the couple to split up. The father of the bride was mad as hell about the expense of the wedding that came out of his pocket. The groom has since moved on with his own life. Discovering the woman he was going to marry had cheated on him the night before their wedding made him break it off. He hasn't gotten married but I hear he's dating someone and it looks serious enough they may get married soon. The bride has been having problems trying to get the respect of her family back after that stunt. She once tried to talk to me when I was single to see if we could go out. I told her flat out I had no interest in dating a woman who cheats like she does. We've not spoken since, much to my relief. My pastor once officiated a wedding. He had done all the premarital counseling for the couple. They seemed good to go and fine. Got to the altar. He did his opening prayer and welcome. He gets to the part when he says, "Do you take this woman to be your wife?" and the guy looked at her, beckoned him and said no. Pastor laughed a little and repeated the question thinking he misunderstood. But the guy stopped him and said, "No, I don't." He took the groom aside to a back room, where the guy essentially said that he couldn't do it, that the bride and her mother had manipulated the whole wedding and he had been too chicken to stand up to her before, but that he couldn't throw his life away. They brought in both families and had a very real conversation, and then the pastor had to go back out and explain to the very uncomfortable congregation that there would be no wedding today, that the guests could help themselves to some refreshments, but that the rest of the evening's events were cancelled. It happened to my sister. He lost his bottle and didn't show. He was a turd anyway. I as one of her 3 brothers joined the other 2 on a bit of a manhunt but we didn't find him. He was apparently already out of town. My sister didn't really react at first but my father, several thousand out of pocket, wasn't so quiet. The groom's family, friends and relatives all apologetically and sheepishly melted away as our lot went on for the meal and a drink. Our father ended up being arrested for basically threatening to wipe out his family over the whole thing a few weeks later, and my sister held her head up throughout. Came out with her dignity and carried on. If you're out there, Tim, we still haven't forgotten what a cowardly idiot you are. Long time ago I went to my father's wedding. It would have been his 4th. They got to the altar and mutually decided to call it off. We still had the reception as there was no reason to waste all the booze and food. They stayed together as a couple another month or 2. It's sad I don't even remember her name. Then again, out of the 5 marriages my father had, only 2 of them lasted more than 3 years. I attended a wedding where the bride was left at the altar. Man, it was sad and odd. There was a pretty large audience. Soon enough the time to start comes and goes. Everyone in the audience is sitting there waiting at least 30-60 minutes after the ceremony was supposed to begin, all with no official word from the wedding party or why there was such a long delay. Rumors started going around. People were saying that one of the groomsmen stained his shirt, and a bunch of other stuff that indicated nothing serious. Finally, the bride's father, tears in his eyes, gets up on stage to announce that the groom has had a change of heart. Needless to say, it was pretty shocking, but he told everyone to go on ahead to the reception and eat full dinner, because the food had already been paid for, so someone might as well enjoy it. I couldn't believe it, but the bride actually showed up at the reception and greeted everyone with a smile, no less. The groom did not make an appearance. The bride got married a few years later to a guy with the same first name, oddly, but the groom is still single to this day. Apparently, he was never truly ready to get married, but he couldn't bring himself to say anything until the pressure finally got to him on the big day. He got a lot of flack from friends and strangers who didn't even know them, naturally, but the 2 of them ended up agreeing that since he wasn't ready, then it was a good thing that he did not commit, though he definitely regrets the way he led her on. The strangest part of the whole day, the wedding was on the 1st of April. Yes, I used to play the harp in weddings. In Chicago, I was playing a wedding that was in a hotel event room, as opposed to a church, and where a judge was officiating. It was a small wedding, maybe 20-30 guests, and the groom didn't show up. The bride had gotten there earlier with her bridal party, and apparently the groom was having an episode of PTSD or something. My dad went to a society wedding in the 90s in the UK. The ceremony went ahead without incident and they had got to the speeches. The groom stood up, said, "I'd like to thank my beautiful wife and my brilliant best man, as they've been ducking each other for the past 6 months. Cheers." He downed his drink and walked out the back to stunned silence. Apparently the father of the bride went round putting the corks back in the bottles, shouting parties over. Everyone out. He seemed to think he could get money back on the booze. Late to the party. This was sometime in the 70s. My uncle in India was attending the wedding of some not so close friends. Totally common to have 1,000 people at a wedding with many people that barely know the couple in attendance. The bride was left at the altar and literally standing on the stage and waiting while everyone was watching. My uncle stepped up and said he'd marry her. He must have felt some sudden rush of Bollywood go through him. Anyway, she said yes and they are happily married to this day. Edit. Story below. Well, it was the night before when all the guests were checked in at the hotel and the guy broke it off. Which is plenty close enough to the altar in my book, seeing as I still had to pay to get out there. Guy gal were from my college. I was one of the girls' suitemates in an apartment of 6 people, and they were quite religious, so decided to get married before he started grad school at MIT because, you know, 6. Girl was also from a family where I guarantee she was under pressure to find a nice boy at college to boot. I guess the guy was not as on board with the marriage as she was, though, as he was the one to call it off. I think he knew she wasn't the one, but was under plenty of expectations from friends' family to see it through, so he didn't admit it to himself until it was real. Mind, I was kinda okay with that, as sure they were more religious than me. I was in with a group of good Christian girls because they make for good roommates, but it was a weird relationship. For example, the guy would come in every night to read his fiancée a bedtime story, door open of course, from the Bible. So yeah, We ended up spending the Friday night all gossiping about just WTF happened, and most of us in the casual circle of friends just went home the next day. No point of spending another night in small town Ohio if we didn't have to. Lost touch with them both soon after, but I hope they both found what they were looking for. I was a wedding coordinator at a Catholic church in Manhattan. Our church was booked for a large wedding party from Connecticut. They told us to expect at least 500 people as the bride and the groom came from large Italian families. When the day of their wedding came, the only people who showed up were members of the groom's side of the family. It was odd because we had seen the bride the night before at the wedding rehearsal and everything seemed fine. But the next day, the bride and her party were no-shows. The groom tried his best to keep his composure in an effort to track down the bride. The groom had his friends and family and myself call anyone who might have a clue as to where she went. Minutes passed, and eventually hours passed. The groom begged me to let the current party stay in hopes that his bride-to-be would show up. I let his party stay an extra 15 minutes before I had to kick them all out and prepare for the next wedding that afternoon. We never learned of what happened to the bride. Her absence remains a mystery today. Late to the party, but why not? At my mom's wedding to my ex-stepdad, she realized once at the altar that she'd forgotten the rings in her jacket pocket. Since she knew where she hung her jacket, and a couple others, it was a lot easier to retrieve them herself rather than try and explain. So she says she'd be right back. But no one heard her, and takes off running back down the aisle. My ex-stepdad's best man leaned over and says to him, "I don't think she's coming back." Everyone was just shocked and didn't know what to say or do. She returned shortly after. Still a funny moment for the wedding video. Too bad she didn't actually bail. Would have saved her a divorce. My grandpa did. He was overwhelmed and was marrying a woman who had a 10-year-old. He got scared. Said no. He told my grandmother what happened. They got married the next day. This has happened to 3 people I know. First one was a case of I love you, but I love me, the bride, more. Second was a case of not coming because the groom is in jail. Last one was a case of not coming because the bride is dead. My ex's sister was getting married to this asshole. He was a total ass and no one in the family liked him. He hid his pregnant ex-GF from her for the first 6 months of their relationship and even said the baby wasn't his when it was. Such a drama-filled relationship that we should have known the wedding was going to be crazy. So 2 years into the relationship he proposes, but doesn't want a big wedding, only family at the courthouse. She says okay. The day of the wedding he will not answer his phone. She calls him 50 times while her whole family is on standby wondering if they should continue to get ready. Finally he answers and say he cannot get married BC his daughter's mother found out and is going to take the baby away. So she walks back into the house devastated and says okay, it is off. She then proceeds to cry and talk hello it. Then a week later I get a call where she starts off saying don't hate me. My response is okay, what happened? The groom who jilted her came back and professed his love. He wanted to go to a casino in Nevada to get married. She says okay. So a secret trip is taken so just immediate family can go. At this point everyone is wondering if the wedding is going to happen. We were sworn to secrecy and told not to answer our phones all weekend. She wanted to make sure if he called it off again then no one would know. The wedding did take place that weekend, but 6 months later the marriage is called off and the divorce was filed. Felt like I was in a novella. So I have a friend who was engaged to a girl who he had been with for 7 years. Engaged for about a year I think. This friend ended breaking off the engagement about a month before the wedding to start seeing a co-worker he worked with. He ended up being cheated on by this co-worker, who I found out later on had broken up a different engagement earlier in her career at the same place. It was the day of the wedding and all the friends and family of the bride were called and the family asked for us all to still come to the church, and once we all got there the bride's parents got up and spoke and they just told us that there was not going to be a wedding and they were very sad for their daughter but still invited everyone to go to the reception hall and enjoy the food and everything. The bride's friends had taken her out of town as soon as the groom cancelled the wedding. My dad is a pastor and performed a wedding for a couple. It was the sister of a friend of ours. Not the classiest of families. Sometime during the reception the groom couldn't be found to have the dance. Upon further searching he was discovered to be ducking one of the bridesmaids. The bride freaked out and stormed off, and the party continued. They did not get the marriage annulled. She later became a meth addict and was found wandering the streets naked and claiming to be Jesus. Went into an institution and was later released and then got a divorce. The kids that they had together prior to getting married, 3 of them, were taken by the state and adopted by our friends, the sister of the bride. So I guess the point is, if there is a reason to leave someone at the altar, do it. I work at a large hotel that hosts wedding receptions basically every weekend. Last year, 1 week before a big wedding, we found out that the bride had discovered that the groom had been cheating on her with the maid of honor. They couldn't cancel the reception as they had already paid, so they turned it into a family reunion for the bride's family. That was an awkward night. I have a story. It's not exactly left at the altar but close enough, and hopefully a lesson to people who read it and are considering marrying the person they love of the recent 3 to 5-ish months they've known them. My father and I are part of a cover band. I run the sound and he and his friends play the music. We were hired to play a wedding in a remote community area. First impression of this area is a hippie commune site converted over to live-in workplace. It could have been nice at one time. It was pretty itty by the time this wedding took place. We set up to play outdoors in an open artistically designed amphitheater that I can honestly say would drive any soundcraft engineer and or musician of decent caliber insane. I ducking hated the acoustics in it, especially because of the multiple selling holes and the lack of the top half of the acoustic back wall being omitted due to artistic influence. But I digress. We're here about the 2 idiots getting married, not the itty conditions the band had to play in. We met the bride first. She was very bubbly, personable and excited, as a girl getting married should be. And aside from the wind blowing through the theater area literally numbing everyone's hands and faces, the wedding was off to a good start. Skip ahead to the ceremony, during which both bride and groom are drunk, but not drunk enough to duck it up or be obvious about it. They make it through the words and fancy stuff, then move on to the reception, which took place in the same area as the ceremony. Both the bride and groom consume copious amounts of more alcohol during this time, and I also noted that as soon as they got off the dais they immediately went in opposite directions to familiar groups of friends. Odd but not unheard of. Few games pass, a lot more drinks go down the groom. By this point, can't stand without assistance. The bride has gone from happy girl to buzzed fun time if you don't say the wrong thing to slurring Bridezilla and finally to tantrum throwing sullen drunk war vet movie type. Literally picking fights with both parents on both sides and every time being pried away and cozened by her mother, who took the initial screaming fit. Meanwhile the groom is partying on the other side of the room. The bride and groom are literally on opposite ends of the area, like farthest points from each other while still being in the same building. And the groom launches into the "it's over man, I ducked up, I got married" statements that you usually hear from the unmarried guys at the bachelor party, which are meant in good fun. This guy meant it, and the wife caught wind, and drank more, and fought more. The night culminated in an early out for us when the bride assaulted the groom, bottle in one hand and his hair in her other, while he's laughing saying how much he ducked up by doing this, referring to the wedding. The wife's, I assume former by now, seeing how this happened over 5 years ago, mother pulled the girl off the man and took her off somewhere to cry her ass off, while the groom's friends try to talk him out of his "I'm married" depression and only succeed in making it worse. We quietly get our money, make the fastest load time I have ever seen, and get the duck out of Dodge. The only thing we can manage to say about the whole ordeal that unfolded in front of us is alcohol is a hell of a drug. After looking back on the events, I can clearly see that these 2 people got along like good friends when sober and enjoyed partying with each other often enough to think it would be a good idea to get married. Never marry a person until you've seen them drunk. Paraphrased from a recent-ish mallard, I would append that statement to include "and still love them no matter how ducked up they are." These 2 didn't. Now they're both miserable. This, unfortunately, happened to the sweetest of my sisters. She and her boyfriend had been dating about 2 years and she had been wanting to get married for a few months. Start a family, etc. We'll call them Jean and John. John seemed like one of the most polite, upright men I've met. And when he proposed our whole family was ecstatic. It was a little surprising because, despite her wanting to get married, He seemed like he wasn't ready to settle down. He had worked as a contractor with the military and spent the better part of his grown-up life in the Middle East, collecting big bucks. He also wasn't willing to stay in our state, wanting to move for college and career. At first, she had been adamant about staying near her family, but as they dated she started to change her mind and eventually agreed that she'd move anywhere he wanted to go, be it to the East Coast, Germany, whatever. Point is, she changed a lot being with him. She had a lot of problems with his family. His sister didn't like her. His parents didn't like her, though they took advantage of her sweet nature. She was always at their house, watering plants when they went out of town or taking care of their cats, visiting with them when John was away on business. His parents were both on disability and relied on John to provide for them 100%. They had even moved into his home when they lost their own, as had his sister, who also relied on his financial support until she got married. So anyway, Jane and John announced that they're engaged, and my family is thrilled. We immediately want to throw them a dinner to celebrate the engagement and meet his parents. Since during the 2 years they dated we'd only briefly meet his dad and never his mom. We planned a party at his house, but it gets changed because he thinks his parents would just leave. That's the first that we hear about how unsupportive his side of the family is, that they wouldn't even attend a dinner at the house they live at in honor of the engagement. The engagement lasts for about half a year, and about a month before the wedding they actually push the date back 3 weeks in the hope that during the extra time they'd finally be able to get his parents' approval. During the engagement, John participates in things like Jane's bridal shower. He calls in to give answers during a party game, gets gifts from my family, helps prepare wedding favors, and generally seems very excited about marrying my sister. Still, we only hear about John's family disapproval and do not meet his mother. The night before the wedding, my family comes out in force to decorate the church where the reception will be held. I have family members who've flown in from the other half of the country to be there, and we're all having a great time. John is there, and he is quieter than normal, but he is still helping to set up decorations and lights. Later on in the evening, he disappears to the bathroom and Jean tells us he's thrown up, feeling sick, and is going to go home and rest while we finish decorating. We all go and give him hugs, tell him to feel better, and that we're all excited about the morning, and he nods along. Around 10 PM, his parents show up to the church. They're raging, telling us their son would never marry our sister, that it's all a farce, that the wedding isn't going to happen. My sister and father try and talk with them, my dad asking what it is about this sister that they don't want their son to marry her, and they eventually say she's not good enough for him. It gets heated, and my dad asks them to leave. When they leave, my sister tries calling John and gets no answer. For the next few hours, she's hysterical. She can't get a hold of him. She has someone drive by his house and he's not there. Finally, his sister, we'll call her B, answers, saying John is so sick that he's in the hospital and that none of our family cares if he lives or dies. She sends a picture of John laying in a bed, but it doesn't look like a hospital room or anything. If Jane was hysterical before, she's doubly so now. B pretty much repeats what John's parents said, and then turns the phone off. This all goes down by about 2 AM. The next morning, the bride and groom were expected for some religious ceremony at 9 AM. Jane is there. John doesn't show. He still hadn't contacted her or anyone on her side of the family since leaving the night before. The wedding was set for 11 AM. We all gather at a family member's house, dreading what will happen as it gets closer to 11. My parents had been with Jean all morning, and drove her to the house we were all at. We ended up spending the day there. Everyone quiet like we were at a funeral with spouts of, but he was just there last night, and he seemed like he was really happy, while we tried to figure out what had happened. Friends of the family went back to the church and took down the wedding decorations, and also contacted the guests to let them know there'd be no ceremony. Poor Jane was just crushed that day. It wasn't until a week later that she was able to get a hold of John. She's never told us what he said, what reason he gave her. She just would say that it's over. That all happened at the beginning of this year. Nowadays, she seems like her old self. No wanting to move to Germany or anything. She hasn't dated and it's probably going to take her a long time to get over this. We try not to bring him up, since she's obviously trying to move on. but every so often I dream about going to his house and smashing in all the glass I can find. I was about 7 and was a flower girl with my sister for a wedding. It was being held in the garden of a country club in Los Angeles. Well, being as it's Southern California, no one expected bad weather. It began to pour, and the bride requested the wedding be moved indoors. The groom flipped, went on and on about how he was going to have an outdoor wedding, etc. The argument was so bad that the wedding was called off. I just remember it being really awkward and someone announcing it on the PA system as we all sat in the banquet hall waiting for the rain to let up. The couple then married a month later in Vegas. But I have no idea how they're doing now. I guess as the groom was really drunk. But who knows? I've got a story. My so's brother, who is also a good buddy of mine, was engaged to this nightmare whose greed is only outmatched by her infidelity. None of his friends or family like this girl. Several even tried talking him out of getting married. He's a good guy, but he's a bit too generous with people's faults and had some sort of homing beacon for manipulative skanks. He finds the world's worst chicks to date. This would have been his first wedding and her 4th. She has 2 kids from a prior relationship marriage. 1 kid in her late teens and 1 in her early teens. And both adored my buddy because he treated them better than both of their fathers. Well, 4 days before the wedding, the kids go missing. Me and my so are out of town and we start getting these calls and Facebook posts. Have you seen the girls? Everyone is on a panic. Cops are called and my buddy's fiancée is working it that the girls were abducted by some religious cult. FBI gets involved. It's a huge deal and the authorities start trying to find out why this girl thinks her kids are abducted by a religious cult. 2 days before the wedding, my buddy gets a call from the girls because the sheriff finally tracked them down. They told him they'd been crashing with friends of the older girl's boyfriend out in the country and was tired of the it their mom was putting them through because this was the 4th time she'd pulled this on them growing up. The older girl confesses that she and her sister heard their mom making arrangements to move them all up to somewhere in Scrack, Idaho to shack up with some bro she'd been sleeping with behind my buddy's back. They knew about the cheating, but didn't want to duck up the wedding because they genuinely liked him as a stepdad and thought this time would be different. She told him her mom was going to go through with the wedding but make arrangements to move up to ID. She was planning on selling the ridiculous $6,000 engagement ring he bought her, and if she could get her hands on all of it, his dead mother's jewelry, to finance the move. They were the ones who finally convinced my buddy this girl wasn't worth marrying, though his dumbass is still letting her live in his house rent-free and without a job because he can't kick her and the youngest daughter out with no place to go. TLDR, if the FBI gets involved and the kids rat out your fiancé, best walk away from the wedding. Copy paste from when I've seen this before on AskReddit. Another classic not me but comment, but I think it's relevant. My aunt was left at the altar. Her husband just basically never showed up for the wedding. They had been dating for almost 2 years and lived together for one of them. He was the one who suggested getting married. She described the experience almost like having a heart attack. One of the happiest days of her life turned into her worst nightmare. She has dealt with abandonment issues for years and has seen many therapists. Her biggest problem now is she doesn't believe anyone actually loves her. She doesn't think she's pretty, nice, and rarely speaks. She used to be one of the most outgoing people I know. I still love her, but this was 3 years ago and I'm losing hope fast. TLDR, don't leave anyone at the altar please. Wedding pro here. Best one I ever heard about. Groom ditches bride a few weeks before the event when nothing is refundable. Bride sends exact copy of invite that says something to the effect of met the wrong man. Gave the wrong finger. Please join me for a charity gala. Has whole wedding with friends and family and donates all gifts to greater good. Go her.